Welcome to the 2-minute warning interview series where we take a detailed, if rapid, dive into what is happening and perhaps most importantly, what should be happening in the energy transition in the Middle East and beyond. My name is 𝗙𝗰𝗲𝘀𝗆. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence, and I'm very glad to say that 𝗙𝗰𝗲𝘀𝗆, who is the founding partner and CEO of Magna4, is with me today. Hi, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, and thank you very much for having us. It's an honor to contribute to this fantastic video.
Thank you, but trust me, the honor's on our side, so thank you. We're just going to dive in. I think I'm going to give a quick overview because I'd be really keen, once I've given this overview, to hear your opinions on where the opportunities lie, because the oil and gas sector faces a lot of challenges right now. We've got over 230 billion in impairments and asset write-offs last year alone. We still don't know what the situation is for this year. The financial environmental argument for fossil fuel divestment is growing. Although we're seeing oil prices strengthen a little bit, we're hearing more and more and more about peak oil within the decade. OPEC, the entity championing oil producers worldwide, is saying 2040 is viable. Up to the, add to this, we've got $1 trillion in US dollars, though many estimates are far higher, of stranded assets for fossil fuel industry worldwide if the current climate goals are met. And as we all know, especially following the recent IPCC report, and in case anybody's been living under a rock, we very much need to meet those climate targets. So this puts oil and gas community in quite a squeeze. And we've of course seen many try to be proactive and pioneering, even establishing renewable entity divisions, and some even going further than that. But I'd just be keen to hear from your point of view as an overview from what you see. How do you think they're faring? Do you think as an industry overall that they're doing enough?
Well, let me first get out there that indeed there is a massive divestment and we see quite some money in stranded assets, but also a huge investment in renewable energy. And I think this is also, I would say, an opportunity that is here to stay. And it's a transformation. I think this is not I would say, a turnkey change. No. And to put also an optimistic number next to your number into the stranded assets, we've also seen that in 2019, $302 billion was invested in renewable energies worldwide, where we also see, I would say, the tier one players really stepping up to the plate in having that transformation into renewable energy. What we see actually is that there is quite a push of shareholders to go faster. And I think the major risk is that the tier one players are going too fast. This is, I think, a long-term transformation. Again, it's not a turnkey change. And what we see now is that if shareholders are placing too much pressure on tier one oil players, is that they are leaving the space for tier two and tier three players. And the risk of that is that they take ESG factors less serious. So the factors gravitating around environmental, social, and governmental. And that is what we see as a major risk at the moment. So yes, the opportunity for renewable energy is absolutely there. Of course, we see a lot of opportunity in both hydro, I would say both, we see it in hydro and wind, solar, biofuels, but also other sources like geothermal. But there, the risk is really to go too fast under stakeholder pressures, as we've seen, of course, now with a few cases where actually courts decided that Shell had to do more to invest more.
Indeed. So from your point of view, you would say that actually the risk, let's say you mentioned tier one there, so we'll stick with that. Let's say the risk for tier one oil and gas companies isn't the transition so much, it's more the speed at which they're pursuing it, and that there's a risk of making mistakes now and perhaps not establishing the correct metrics that later on are going to lead to expensive backtracking. You're saying that's actually the greater risk rather than the energy transition itself?
Well, the energy transition is a massive it's a massive transformation. We all probably are deeply aware as players in the industry that this is not to be taken too lightly. It is a big transformation, but what I'm trying to say is that the transformation will take 5 to maybe 25 years. Indeed. And that during the time of transformation, there is a phase out of fossil fuel and a phase in of renewable energy. And if we go too fast It's not only that, of course, we can make mistakes, or that there will be too much of one source and too little of the other source with disruptions in the energy industry. But what we feel is that the risk of climate change is managed best by tier one players in a controllable pace that know how to invest and how to divest with control, and that they know that the risks they are taking, they're doing them substantiated with data and with everything that also needs to be invested into the renewable energy sector.
So calm and steady for tier one is what we need.
Calm and steady is what we need indeed. Controllable risk, controllable opportunity taken, and that is probably also the best for environmental, social, and governmental factors. And that is probably also, I would say, the most controlled way in managing the risk of climate change.
And what about the differences here between international oil companies and national oil companies? What kind of differences are you seeing in the path they're having to take? Obviously, national oil companies have to be commercial champions. They also have to be social champions, and the economics of them are so deeply intertwined into the national treasuries. And IOCs, we know that they operate on a far more commercial basis. They have their CSR and their ESG boxes to tick, of course, but not in the same way that NOCs have to operate. How do you see those two camps moving differently through this energy transition up to 2025, for example?
Yeah, well, I think that the international oil companies obviously are much more in the spotlights. And seeing a lot of attention in media, you know, to go fast and do the right thing. So while they are facing the same transformation with the same challenges, it is, in our view, quite key that the international oil companies are, I would say, role modeling what is the best thing to do, and also start communicating on what is the best thing to do. I think there is a role for more international companies who are more in the spotlights to also start communicating about what they are doing and why they are doing it in the pace that they are doing it. So that is, I think, you know, one of the biggest challenges, which is always, of course, a big challenge if you are, you know, a bigger player in any industry. They get a lot of attention if they do something wrong. It's, you know, it's in the front pages of international newspapers. So it's even more important that they start communicating about what is the best pace, how are they taking ESG factors into account, and what is it that the oil industry as a whole is doing to manage the risk of climate change.
And what about tier 2 and tier 3 oil and gas companies? What kind of opportunities do you think that they can be exploring? Do you see them providing supportive roles to the headline IOCs? Do you see them seeking more consolidation, or can they really capture the more agile side of innovation and R&D? Is that where they can excel? What's their path forward in your view?
Well, I think they say they play the same part as the tier one players. I think they also have to move into renewable energies, but they could maybe also look into more local initiatives and also team up with local players with, you know, who are playing with renewable energy in their region. Obviously, different parts of the world have different options with respect to renewable energy. When there is a lot of wind, probably wind energy is more efficient than in other parts of the world where there, for example, is a lot of sun. So I think local players have to probably play the local game and also team up with other players to have, I would say, that diversity of energy landscape in their part of the world.
So really partnerships and localizations is what we would expect to see more from tier 2 and tier 3.
Absolutely, absolutely, because they probably have maybe less investment power to have huge investments, and then it's probably a better strategy for them to team up with other local players to have that energy transition executed in their part of the world.
And also just looking at supply chains, because we're talking obviously about localization and partnerships, and even with tier 1 and the challenges they have in their supply chains to make sure everybody's on the same page. And we'd be keen to hear your views on tier 1 IOCs and how they can really make those nitty-gritty, those granular changes to the supply chain to support scope 1 and 2, of course, and in time, scope 3. Do you see a lot of momentum heading towards rethinking supply chains? Because we hear a lot about renewable energy growth, we hear a lot about hydrogen exploration as well, and that market and investment in exploring that, but we don't hear as much on the granular side of supply chains. Is it happening behind the scenes? We just don't hear about it.
Well, actually, you ask a very, very interesting question, and I'm very, very passionate about this specific topic. And let me bring the dialogue a step further.
Okay.
Supply chain, as we see it today, of course, is bound, I would say, to the traditional industry, energy industry as we see it, with traditional energy supply chains. If you would say fast forward 10 to maybe 30 years further ahead, you will see that the supply chain is probably disrupted tremendously, because the next big thing is that every household and every building is creating energy in itself. We've seen the disruptions in many more industry where there is actually a decentralization of energy creation taking place, especially looking into photovoltaic, solar panels, but also windmills. It is very much to be foreseen that energy creation is highly decentralized. Can you imagine that we would start building buildings, offices, and houses with materials that are solar panels in itself, that would have shadow or shade creation by photovoltaic materials? So that means that the supply chain is decentralized, and that the energy that is consumed in a decentral way needs to be given back to the network or to the supply chain. So with supply chain, yes, we see massive disruptions coming up, but I think there is a much bigger disruption taking place in the supply chain due to the fact that energy will be created in very decentral ways by households, by offices, what have you.
Do you see enough progress on that front? Because this decentralization of energy supply has been on our lips for several years now, and obviously we've seen the huge acceleration in the general conversation about the energy transition over the last 18 months. So it's coming more and more to the fore, becoming more and more mainstream. Do you see the progress that you would hope to see? Like you say, it is a mammoth rethinking of how we use energy on a personal basis, on a commercial basis, a government-led basis, everything. It's a complete rethink. Do you see enough progress underway now to make sure that those goals are achieved in time?
Yeah, I think it's more a mammoth rethinking of how we generate energy. We obviously can go much faster, but again, this is the transformation that benefits by a controlled pace and not going too fast. What we see and what is very positive is that the efficiency of that is relatively high. So we see that houses or offices that are completely made of solar panels, so to say, they create more energy than that they can consume. So we don't see the movement going very fast, because it's also a massive change for the infrastructure, how we distribute energy, and also, of course, for payment and business models. So yes, we see a lot of efficiency, and we see control pace with respect to generation locally of energy, but the change in the supply chain, in the payment models, in the business models is taking a bit more time. But overall,
when do you think we'll start to see more significant changes then? Do you see it happening by 2025, in the next few years, or do you think it's going to take longer?
I think it's going to take a little bit longer, because it's also, of course, depending on the building and the restructuring industry itself. You know, I'm, for example, I'm taking this interview from Amsterdam, and our offices are downtown. I'm literally looking into buildings that are centuries and centuries old. And of course, we can make minor changes to such buildings, but I think overall it will take a bit of time to really have our buildings, our windows generating energy, to have, everything, every new project of houses or industrial sites being built completely with solar panels.
And of course, there's such a big factor about being very accelerating efforts now. We're seeing huge population growth up to 2025, 9.8 billion people is the estimate. That's nearly a third, just under a third growth to get there, to get to that 2050 target. And of course, those people need homes. That's not accounting for all the over 1 billion people, at least at the moment, who don't have proper housing already. So the volume of property that's needed, in addition to the revamp of existing property assets to make them environmentally friendly, it's a massive challenge. Just before we wrap up, I just want to ask you about COP, which is obviously very much just around the corner, and I want to ask you about the impact that you think it might have on oil and gas companies' momentum. Obviously, we've missed a year, and there has been huge progress in that year missed, which was obviously due to the pandemic. But we have in energy and industrial sectors worldwide, they need to lower their carbon footprint. We all know that. They account for about 75% of emissions. So when it comes to COP and the spotlights on those oil and gas companies, as you mentioned, it's usually tier one that have the brightest spotlight. What do you think we might see as a result of COP? Do you think we'll see a big step change in momentum?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I'm not very keen to see a big step change in momentum. I'm keen to see to be a big step change in thinking, but then have a gradual execution of that transformation.
So things like putting a price on carbon and metrics about how to do scope 1 and scope 2 and that sort of progress.
Yes, I think I'm optimistic about that sort of progress. I think the market is ready for that. I think we see players also very keen in going into that how to say dynamic, or I do see a big step change both in thinking as in acting. So yes, I think the CO2 market and the trade therein that we see will definitely push forward.
Excellent. Well, I certainly hope we're right. We'll find out pretty soon, and hopefully you'll be able to rejoin us as well, and we can look back on COP and look back on what was achieved, how it's impacted the market, and how we can look ahead to 2022 as well. Marisha, thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much once more for having me. It was my honor.
Thank you. Bye.